There is a stretch of desert that was once the wettest, greenest place on the African continent, and buried inside it are two women whose bodies kept a secret their culture never wrote down. They lived roughly 7,000 years ago, in a green corridor assumed to have spent thousands of years connecting the peoples of North Africa to the peoples south of the Sahara. If that assumption were true, their DNA should show it. Mixed ancestry, blended lineages, a genetic record of constant contact across a landscape built for exactly that kind of contact. Instead, when scientists finally sequenced their genomes, the two women turned out to belong to a population that had never been documented before. A lineage that appears to have sat almost entirely alone for tens of thousands of years, in a place that by every reasonable expectation should have made that kind of isolation nearly impossible. This is not a story about a lost city, or a forgotten war, or a vanished empire. It is the story of a population that has no name in any history book, uncovered by accident inside two mummified bodies from a rock shelter that almost never gave up its DNA at all. For most of the last century, the accepted account of the Sahara was reasonably simple. Today, it is the largest hot desert on Earth, but it was not always that way. Between roughly 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, a period climatologists call the African humid period, monsoon rains pushed much further north than they do now, and the Sahara turned green. Lakes formed where there is now only sand. Rivers cut channels that still show up in satellite imagery. Hippos, crocodiles, and giraffes lived in what is now southern Libya and Algeria, and human communities followed the water, herding cattle and settling permanently along its lake shores. Archaeologists had documented this world in extraordinary detail through rock art alone, thousands of painted and engraved images showing cattle, swimmers, and daily life spread across the Takarkori Mountains. For decades, the working assumption among most researchers was straightforward. A green Sahara meant an open Sahara, a corridor that would have let people, herds, and genes move freely between North Africa and the populations living south of it for thousands of years. The rock art showed what people were doing during the Green Sahara. It could not show who those people actually were, genetically, or where their ancestors had come from. DNA rarely survives in hot, arid environments, and for decades, the Sahara's genetic history stayed dark. That changed with two naturally mummified individuals recovered from the Takarkori rock shelter in the Takarkori Mountains of southwestern Libya, dated to roughly 7,000 years ago. When researchers finally extracted usable ancient DNA and ran whole genome sequencing, the results did not confirm a corridor population blended from north and south. The two women shared close to no detectable ancestry with populations from south of the Sahara, despite living during the wettest, most habitable stretch the desert had seen in millennia. Whatever contact the green corridor was assumed to have enabled, their genomes showed almost none of it. And this was not a small statistical wobble, easily explained away as noise in a handful of ancient samples. It was a clean, consistent absence, exactly where the model predicted mixing should have been easiest to find. The first explanation researchers reached for is what geneticists sometimes call a ghost lineage, a population that existed, contributed genes to the historical record, and then left no clear descendants carrying its name forward. Under this model, the Takarkori women belonged to a distinct North African lineage that had already split away from other human populations roughly 50,000 years ago, around the same time the ancestors of everyone outside Africa were leaving the continent and had then remained largely isolated ever since. Real evidence supports this. When compared to 15,000-year-old foragers from Rewrote cave in Morocco, linked to the Ibero-Maurusian culture, the Takarkori genomes turned out to be closely related, and both groups sit at roughly the same genetic distance from sub-Saharan African lineages. That is consistent with one long continuous North African population, rather than a series of separate, unrelated arrivals. But the theory has a real gap. It does not explain where this lineage sheltered during the hyper-arid millennia before the rains returned, or why isolation held once the desert turned green. The second explanation focuses on a different puzzle inside the same data. By the time these two women lived, cattle herding was already established across the Sahara, a practice most archaeologists had long assumed spread the same way farming did in much of the world, through the movement of actual farming and herding populations, not just the movement of an idea. If pastoralism arrived in the Sahara that way, the Takarkori genomes should carry a detectable trace of Near Eastern ancestry, since that is the region most closely tied to early cattle domestication. They do not in any meaningful or detectable amount. Only much later, roughly 6,400 years ago, does trace Levantine ancestry finally begin appearing in the region at all. That gap has led researchers to propose that herding spread here largely through cultural diffusion, practices and knowledge passed between neighboring groups without a corresponding wave of people. It is an elegant reading of the data, but it rests partly on an absence, on what the genome does not contain, which is a harder thing to prove conclusively than a signal that is actually there. The study that settled the shape of this question was published in Nature in April of 2025, led by Salem and senior author Johannes Krause of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology with researchers from Sapienza University of Rome. Using whole genome sequencing on the best-preserved Takarkori individual, they confirmed a previously unknown ancestral North African lineage, distinct from both sub-Saharan African and Eurasian populations, isolated for tens of thousands of years. Salem described it, in her words, as a deeply rooted and long-isolated genetic lineage. But the genome held one more genuine twist. And it is the detail that makes this more than a simple isolation story. The women carried roughly 10 times less Neanderthal DNA than people living outside Africa today, yet noticeably more than contemporary sub-Saharan Africans carry. A small, specific trickle of ancestry from beyond the continent had still reached this otherwise closed population at some earlier point, even as contact with their nearest sub-Saharan neighbors stayed essentially absent across tens of thousands of years of shared geography. Think about learning that a relative you thought you understood completely lived a whole chapter of life you never knew existed, a decade abroad, a marriage before the one you grew up hearing about. The instinct is to feel something has been taken away. Sit with it longer and the opposite tends to happen. They do not shrink. They get larger than the frame you had put around them. What connects you to them was never diminished by the discovery. It was revealed to be older and wider than assumed. That is roughly what these two women from Takarkori do to the story of North Africa. They do not erase the region's real, well-documented connections to the rest of the continent in later periods. They add a much older layer beneath it, a population that endured on its own terms, in one of the harshest environments on Earth, for longer than most nations in recorded history have existed. That is not a smaller story than the one North Africa was already known for. It is a considerably bigger one, belonging to people who left no written name, only the molecular evidence that they were here, and that for most of their long history, they endured largely alone. This is not an isolated pattern. In 2020, geneticists Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman, then at UCLA, used a different statistical method to search for West African populations, including the Yoruba and the Mende, for signs of ancient interbreeding without needing archaic fossil DNA to compare against. They found it anyway, a ghost population, their own term, an unknown archaic hominin lineage, related to nothing yet sequenced, contributing between 2 and 19% of the ancestry in the modern genomes studied. Different continent, different depth of time, same underlying lesson. Wherever geneticists look closely at African population history, hidden lineages keep surfacing, contributing real ancestry to real people alive today. then vanishing from every written and archaeological record. Takarkori is simply the clearest, best dated example so far. The pattern underneath all of it is the same. Identity was never a single fixed point of origin, waiting quietly in the past to be discovered whole. It has always been closer to a direction of travel, assembled continuously, out of populations, history never thought to name. Here is the detail most coverage of this study skipped past. The Takarkori remains are not mummies in the deliberate, embalmed sense of Egypt, further east. They are natural mummies, preserved by nothing more than the extreme dryness of the rock shelter, one catalogued simply as individual H1. This was not even the first time scientists studied that individual's DNA. An earlier study had already sequenced mitochondrial DNA from these same remains, years before the 2025 team returned with whole genome sequencing and found the deeper lineage the first pass had missed entirely. The technology had to catch up to the body twice before it would tell the truth. If there is one thing this desert keeps teaching the people who study it, it is that the sand does not erase history. It just waits for someone with better instruments. If this is the kind of history you want more of, before it is common knowledge, subscribing means you will not have to wait for someone else to explain it to you first. And if this changed how you picture the Sahara, A-like helps it reach people still picturing a corridor. There is another vanished lineage waiting in the next video.